Good afternoon. My paper is entitled Personal Identity and Hypostasis, the Christological Crisis of Personhood. In his influential book, The Quest of the Historical Jesus, Albert Schweitzer wrote that at Chalcedon, the doctrine of the two natures dissolved the unity of the person and thereby cut off the last possibility of a return to the historical Jesus. He continues, that the historic Jesus is something different from the Jesus Christ of the doctrine of the two natures seems to us now self-evident. We can, at the present day, scarcely imagine the long agony in which the historical view of the life of Jesus came to birth. Schweitzer is by no means alone in his sense that the dogmatic confession of Christ's two natures was incompatible with historical inquiry into the figure of Jesus of Nazareth. And it was not only the historical Jesus scholars who rejected the possibility of speaking of Jesus as a historical person with two natures, for many theologians then and now have argued similarly. The full question of why these scholars feel compelled to wander so far afield from conciliar orthodoxy cannot be addressed with any adequacy here. And rather than attempting a detailed genealogical account, I want to discuss an idea that seems to have been in the air, so to speak, by the 18th century and remains influential today. This is an account of personhood grounded in consciousness and/or memory, an approach originally proposed by the 17th century English philosopher John Locke. From time to time, theologians have addressed the difference between substantial accounts of personhood and Locke's approach, but far more often others have unreflectively assumed the latter when discussing Christology, such that the question bears revisiting today. So to begin with, the Lockean account of personal identity. Around the middle of the 17th century, the question of personal identity began to shift away from ontology toward a more subjective approach. No longer understood as something inscribed in things themselves, it was now thought of as arising from our concepts or ideas of things. Alongside this shift, the idea of personhood began to serve a different purpose philosophically. For Boethius, a person was a particular type of supposit, and as such answered questions related to individuation. However, virtually all of the prominent English philosophers of the 17th century were nominalists, and nominalists do not need to account for individuation. As a result, they began to consider personhood by asking what preserves personal identity across time and change. This took various forms, from the corpuscular philosophy of Hobbes, who approached it in terms of the identity of bodies, to the Cartesians who were interested in what preserves the identity of the soul. This overall change in perspective initiated a theological debate at the time about the Trinity between substantialists and Cartesians, and a related discussion about the continuity of personal identity after death. When Locke published his paper on identity in the second edition of his Essay Concerning Human Understanding in 1694, he forged a new direction for this conversation. For the same consciousness being preserved, he wrote, whether in the same or different substances, the personal identity is preserved. Locke's account is about diachronic personal identity, not synchronic individuation. He argues that bare existence is sufficient to account for individuation, and it remains a leading approach in the literature despite centuries of critical response. Locke distinguishes between three abstract ideas under which we can consider human subjects: soul, man, and person. Soul refers to the thinking substance, and Locke remains agnostic about its immateriality, though notably many subsequent thinkers pick up his approach because of its compatibility with a materialist philosophy of mind. Man essentially refers to the human body, though the exact referent of these terms will depend on one's anthropology. The importance of the concept of person in this triad is that it indicates the aspect of a human subject with respect to which it can be judged from a legal or moral perspective. The question of personal identity is the ground of law and morality. Whom can we hold accountable for their actions? Not the soul or the man, but the person, a concept which Locke grounds in a relatively novel concept of consciousness. In the English-speaking world, the first philosopher to use the term consciousness with a particular technical meaning was the Cambridge Platonist Ralph Cudworth. Drawing on Neoplatonic sources, he used the term to indicate an awareness of one's own thoughts and actions. However, Cudworth only ascribes to consciousness a role in knowledge, and he holds that personal identity is secured by the immaterial substance of the soul. Locke takes up this concept of consciousness, which is distinct from two closely related notions, reflection and memory. Reflection occurs when our mental acts become objects of observation. It is a higher order mental act directed toward other mental acts. Consciousness, on the other hand, is understood as a presence of the mind to itself, an immediate awareness that attends all acts of thinking, but is not itself a distinct or higher order act of thinking. For Locke, unlike Cudworth, consciousness does not account for the individuation of substances. It presupposes a thinking substance, and adds a particular abstract idea under which it is to be considered. Memory is the way our consciousness relates to the past. It is the avenue for acts of thinking linked to the past, to which consciousness attends, and it is through its relation to past experiences that personal identity is preserved over time. While memory can span gaps of unconsciousness, for example, dreamless sleep, loss of memory can mean that I am still the same man as before, but no longer the same person, and in this way personhood floats free of substance. Locke's approach was developed in various ways by Leibniz and Wolff, attacked by Hume, and re-established on different grounds by Kant. Its influence is also perceptible in the reflection on das Gefühl, feeling or sentiment, in the German Romantic movement. Schleiermacher transformed this broader Romantic concept into the distinctive notion of the feeling of absolute dependence, which stood at the foundation of his dogmatic project. By grounding dogma in religious consciousness, he established an alternative basis for theological speech that was broadly empirical. Further, because he developed a Christology out of human subjectivity, Schleiermacher has been referred to as the father of consciousness Christology. While Schleiermacher is directly influenced far more by Kant than Locke, the concept of personal identity grounded in consciousness stands at the heart of his Christological project, and appears to play a key role in his rejection of Chalcedon. In his mature work, The Christian Faith, Schleiermacher interrogates the Chalcedonian approach, asking, how then is the unity of a person's life to endure with the duality of natures without one yielding to the other, or without the two natures blending into each other? He believed that the starting point of Chalcedon inevitably results in either Eutychianism or one of the twin errors of Apollinarianism and Nestorianism. Furthermore, he opposed the diatheletism of the Christian tradition, concluding that if Christ has two wills, then the unity of the person is no more than apparent, and famously reconceiving divine transcendence and human existence, as well as the unity of the two in Christ, in radically new fashion. As Thomas Joseph White has noted, a number of more recent theologians have followed a similar trajectory, and scholars such as Karl Rahner, Jacques Dupuy, Jean Sobrino, and in a different sense, N.T. Wright and Hans-Urs von Balthasar, have sought to ground the unity of Christ in a form of consciousness, thus interpreting the personal union of God and man in the Incarnation through the medium of Christ's human spiritual operations. Even scholars not intending to develop a consciousness Christology often intuitively assume that the confession of one person amounts to or is reducible to positing one consciousness in Christ. Keith Ward stands as a representative example. In his book, Christ and the Cosmos, he states erroneously that, quote, in what was to become patristic orthodoxy, it was asserted that the human consciousness of Jesus was identical with the divine consciousness of the eternal Logos. What is noteworthy is how explicitly and automatically he interprets the patristic language of hypostatic union in terms of consciousness, and he's by no means alone in this. Part 2. Aquinas' account of personal identity. Aquinas, following Boethius, offers a substantial account of personhood. Michael Gorman helpfully unpacks Aquinas' understanding of substance as follows. Substances are all individuals. They all subsist, meaning they exist through themselves and not in another. They all stand under non-subsisting beings, such as accidents, and they are all unified. Unlike a pile of sand, they are just one thing. Person adds to this concept of substance a determinate nature, rational. A substance with a rational nature has dominion over their actions, not simply acting like others, but acting for themselves, and this is why they have a special name over other substances. The scholastic approach, therefore, denies Locke's distinction between substance, man, and person. The man is the same as the person for a realist, because consciousness is conceived of as a power of the substance, and thus accidental to it. A substantial account of personhood, which grounds both synchronic individuation and diachronic identity, cannot be reduced to accidents. If we are only discussing our ideas or naming of things, then we can parse out such accidental features and make them constitutive of our concepts, but that will only replace our understanding of things themselves if we are skeptical about knowledge of essences, which we have good reason not to be. As Henry Felton, an early critic of Locke, noted, we may distinguish between the idea of soul, man, and person in our minds, but they are not separate in things themselves. The scholastic insight is that delimiting our understanding of the human person to a concept of consciousness is tremendously reductive, something of which Locke was well aware. For Aquinas, personhood is not simply one of various ideas we can apply to a substance in terms of its psychological powers. Rather, it signifies a particular substance as it is in its completeness, in suo complemento. It refers to a particular subject of active existence in its entirety. In the Tertia Pars, Aquinas writes that to the hypostasis alone are attributed the operations and the natural properties, and whatever belongs to the nature in the concrete. It is for this reason that the Christian tradition is able to attribute 2 wills to Christ, and why theologians such as Bernard Lonergan extrapolate from that to 2 consciousnesses. Insofar as these are properties of the natures, they are not constitutive of the hypostasis, but are attributed to it, through the communication of idioms. And therefore, the human nature in Christ, writes Aquinas, cannot be called a hypostasis or a suppositum, but the complete being with which it concurs is said to be a hypostasis or suppositum. In order to grasp the central judgment inscribed in classical accounts of Christ's personhood, we cannot reduce the predicate in view to a power of one or both natures, because it would render the union accidental by definition. In fact, the mistake of Schleiermacher and many others who have rejected the Chalcedonian approach was to assume that what the fathers were interested in was discussing the action of 2 natures, whereas what is in view is the assumption of a human nature by a divine person. Aquinas notes in an objection that to act befits a person, not a nature, so that while he is clear that the principle of the assumption belongs to the divine nature itself, he also maintains that the term of the assumption belongs not to the nature itself, but by reason of the person. The divine nature is, of course, inseparable from the divine person, no less so in the Incarnation than from all eternity. But that does not mean that Christology is about parsing out which bits of Jesus' appearance, words, or actions are the result of his divine nature and which are from his humanity. Chalcedon preserves the ancient Jewish confession of the invisibility of God. No one may see me and live, Exodus 33:20. The Incarnation is not about transforming the divine nature to make it available to our senses. As Ian McFarlane helpfully articulates, although the one whom we see in Jesus is none other than the Son of God, what we see in Jesus is simply and exhaustively human flesh and blood. Everything we perceive in Christ is created and human, but it is a human nature taken up and transformed by the active existence of the divine person of the Word. As Rowan Williams writes, this is an act of being which enacts its personal distinctiveness by comprehensively shaping the finite actions of a human subject in such a way that the real and concrete distinctiveness of that subject cannot be spoken of without reference to the Word. Finite agency becomes a real communication of more than it is abstractly considered in itself. Unity at the level of hypostasis and act of being are both far grander claims that can be grasped by the concept of consciousness. The transcendent mystery of subsistent relations, giving a specificity to the eternal act of being of the Word, proceeding from the Father in the eternal unity of the triune Godhead, hypostatically united to a human nature in the Incarnation, is thereby reduced to a strikingly mundane conception of a precognitive awareness of mental acts. Thinking of personhood in terms of consciousness leads us to think of God and humanity in a competitive paradigm, and encourages us to conceive of the unity of Christ by way of the addition of predicates, as if divinity plus humanity adds up to something. There's a sort of Apollinarian cast to this, where we look to replace a feature of Jesus' humanity with a feature of his divinity. In this case, not necessarily the whole mind, but the consciousness. Along similar lines, historical Jesus scholars, when they discuss Christology, typically appear to assume that the Chalcedonian approach involves a divine nature being united to the human person of Jesus. Thus, Jesus' divinity is accounted for by the addition of certain divine predicates to a pre-existing human person. Conceiving of personhood in terms of consciousness led Schweitzer et al. Inevitably into a form of Nestorianism that rendered Christ a ghostly, ahistorical figure, a schizophrenically divided jumble of divine and human predicates, far removed from the first-century Jewish man named Jesus of Nazareth, an approach they then rejected. Contrary to this whole picture, Aquinas argues that there is no human person in Christ, but that his human nature is hypostatically united to the divine person of the Word. In other words, there is no finite act of being in virtue of which Christ is who he is, but the act of being of the Word is the sole ground of Jesus of Nazareth's active agency. While the hypostatic union brings about, by the work of the Spirit, certain perfections of Jesus' human nature, it in no way involves the addition of divine predicates to the humanity of Christ, nor the transformation of his human nature into something else. Rather, as Williams articulates, It is an affirmation that the active presence of the Word makes the humanity what it is, in the sense that it makes it to be the way it actively is, not in the sense that it makes it to be the sort of thing it is. In Aquinas' terminology, Christ's humanity is the instrument of his divinity. So to conclude, this discussion illustrates the importance of metaphysics for theological reflection by highlighting how our ideas about individuation and the knowledge of essences transform our theology. If we cannot speak of things in themselves, then we will render properly ontological dogmatic judgments in terms of empirical phenomena, as Schleiermacher does. In Christology, if we can no longer talk about substances and natures, then we're left with psychological descriptions of what it must have felt like to be God incarnate. Ironically, such metaphysical skepticism often leaves us with a perniciously speculative form of theology. As Eric Maskell noted in 1956, I am convinced that the early church was right in seeing the problem of the incarnation as primarily a metaphysical one. I'm frankly amazed to find how often the problem of the incarnation is taken as simply the problem of describing the mental life and consciousness of the incarnate Lord, for this problem seems to me to be strictly insoluble. If I am asked what I conceive to be the metaphysical relation between the human and the divine in Christ, I can at least make some sort of attempt at an answer. But if I am asked to say what I believe it feels like to be God incarnate, I can only reply that I have not the slightest idea, and I should not expect to have it. Whether or not neo-Lockean accounts of personhood in terms of consciousness are adequate to serve as phenomenological descriptions of personal identity and provide sufficient grounds for ethics and law, something we have good reason to question, we must recognize that this emphasis stems from a broader metaphysic. While discussions of consciousness expand our range of idioms for treating philosophical and theological questions, there is no reason to allow such subjective approaches to substitute for substantial accounts of personhood, not least in Christology. In other words, psychological, phenomenological, and historical approaches to philosophical and theological questions are at times valuable and appropriate to the task at hand, but they do not carry within themselves sufficient grounds to reject an attendant consideration of ontology. Furthermore, a substantial account of the unity of Christ provides greater space for historical approaches to Jesus, because it alone protects the integrity and properly finite reality of Christ's human nature. Thank you.